Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag.
Next up is my conversation with poet and translator Jeffrey Yang, whose latest collection from Grey Wolf is one of my favorite of 2018 and definitely the first book that comes to mind as a book that deserves much, much more attention, even as it was picked since this conversation as one of the best poetry collections of the year by the New York Times. Hope you enjoy it. But before we begin, if you do find Between the Covers is a regular part of your listening habits, consider becoming a supporter of the show in the new year. If you support the show with a per-episode pledge at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, you can get access to bonus material from each conversation, a copy of Jesse Ball's out-of-print book, Vera and Linus, or a signed copy of Ursula K. Le Guin, Conversations on Writing, as well as receive notices and intros from me when each episode goes live. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can go to davidnaiman.com and click support. Either way, I'm excited for the year ahead, both the conversations I have lined up and a few surprises about the show that hopefully I'll be able to share sometime early in the year. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is poet, editor, and translator Jeffrey Yang. Yang is the author of the poetry collections Vanishing Line and the Penn Joyce Osterweil award-winning An Aquarium, both out with Grey Wolf Press. He is editor of the anthologies Birds, Beasts, and Seas, Nature Poems, and Time of Grief, Mourning Poems, and the collection The Sea is a Continual Miracle, Sea Poems and Other Writings by Walt Whitman. Yang is the translator of Amatjan Osman's Uyghurland, The Farthest Exile, the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Liu Xiaobo's June 4th Elegies, the 11th century Song Dynasty poet Su Shi's East Slope, and poet Bei Dao's autobiography City Gate Open Up. Jeffrey Yang works as an editor at New Directions Publishing and New York Review of Books, and he's here today to talk about his latest book of poetry, Hey, Marfa, from Grey Wolf, a book of image verse, his poems and conversation with paintings and drawings by the British artist Rackstraw Downs. Susan Howe calls Hey, Marfa a commonplace book, memoir, and hybrid obituary for things, following a trail of last words and communal losses. Here is a history learning to listen with eyes, and mourning, recovering the dead travelers on the road. Hey, Marfa transmits voltage or vitalized matter as words reach to words. Tim Johnson of the Marfa Book Company says, Yang rebuilds for the reader a town that is notable for its many stark contrasts, restored and ruined buildings, wealth and poverty, international art and border enforcement. Hey, Marfa makes a remarkable poetic accounting of the ways imagination is currently working with and against the histories and myths of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and the American West. The Poetry Society of America calls Hey, Marfa a truly unique project of text and visuals, a synthesis of lyric and history and landscapes. And finally, Booklist says, Yang has constructed an Escher-like collage by weaving together musings on Southwest America's past and accounts of current art movements. illustrated with the sublime paintings and drawings of British artist Rackstraw Downs. Hey Marfa is itself an art object as much as a book of exacting poetry, a collection to read in wonder and then reread, discovering something new. Welcome to Between the Covers, Jeffrey Yang.
Thank you so much, David. It's great to be here.
So before we talk about the ways you engage with and interrogate and unpack place, specifically Marfa and Hey Marfa, I wonder if we could start with describing the more general reputation Marfa, Texas has in the imagination. Like if you were to imagine being a member of the Chamber of Commerce or an artist who is returning from an artist residency who maybe didn't think deeply about what underpins Marfa. What is Marfa for someone who hasn't heard of Marfa?
So I think it's a place that's pretty remote, first of all, and I think that's part of how it's able to kind of continue the way it is. It's a place where a lot of creative people, artists and writers and clothes makers and all kinds of people have found a space to kind of do their work. It's also a place where it's very close, of course, to the border, to Presidio on our side and Ojinaga on the Mexico side. And so a lot of people who work also in the town come up from there. And so it's really a mix of Mexican Americans and U.S. citizens and people who are out there. And I think most of the people who I've gotten to know there well, like Tim at the Marfa Book Company have found a place there to do what they want to do, and also it's a place where people come and visit, even though it is remote, and so that kind of helps the town too as well. So there's also the Chinati Foundation out there that Donald Judd kind of started.
Tell us a little bit about Donald Judd, since in a way he sort of puts the town on the map as a destination for artists, or at least that's my understanding. So who is Donald Judd, and what did he do with Marfa that has made it a place where someone who may be from some entirely different demographic, different part of the country geographically would come there and have a residency or go look at internationally renowned art?
Yeah, no. So Donald Judd is a contemporary American artist associated with minimalism. And he went out there, and now I'm getting all the dates wrong, but I think it's sometime in the 70s. Is that about right?
I think so.
It's in the book. And he just kind of started to make art out there and buy property. And at the time, there wasn't much else in the town. And as he started to do more of his art out there, and it's an art that's very specific, to the landscape of Marfa, which, is a desert landscape, which I should have said in the beginning. And then it's also there's a little bit of elevation. As you go down south, you go down a little bit. And so he, once he was there, and then other artists kind of came, and then this foundation, the Dia Foundation, started to support some of his work, and then eventually the Chinati Foundation took over that role and included a lot of other artists in their collection. And so the foundation there, there's two things. There's the Chinati Foundation that has a lot of this kind of very place-specific landscape art, with people like Judd and there's some Carl Andre and a lot of different things. And then in the town itself, there's also these buildings that were Judd's kind of residence, his studios, and there's a space for John Chamberlain's art, and so there in that those spaces you could also go as a visitor.
And when you were going there for an artist residency yourself, mm-hmm. were you going there with the intention of looking at Marfa, or did the book Hey Marfa as a project arise once you were there doing some other project?
Yeah, no, that's the thing. I never expected to write anything really about Marfa. I went out there. I was invited there on a 1-month residency to work on a translation by Liu Xiaobo, his June 4th elegies. And I was very strict with my time to doing that because I really needed to get a draft done of the book. And so it was only while I was there that I started to kind of experience being there for a time and also meeting people and seeing a little bit more of the environment around there that I started, I wrote some things while I was there, more notes and maybe a couple starts to poems and observations and things. And it was really when I left that over the years, it kind of just kept staying with me, and what I thought would maybe be a poem or a serial poem kind of just kept kind of staying with me and wanting to be something else.
Yeah.
And so over time, through up through 2017, I was still kind of writing and thinking about these things. And in the book, it spirals out a lot in ways from the actual, if you're talking about the physical place, but it's connected, I think, in a way. So, yeah.
Well, I don't know if I've encountered a book that has a more perfect epigraph. I feel like the few words on the first page, they echo through the whole book, and maybe as a sort of ethos for how you engage with Marfa. So first we get a quote from the old master from the spring and autumn period, both in Chinese and English. And I'm guessing that's Confucius?
Oh, it's Lao Tzu.
It's Lao Tzu.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, from the Tao Te Ching.
Okay. So that quote is, "Truthful words are not beautiful. Beautiful words are not truthful." And then we get a separate unrelated and unattributed line that says, "These lines curve through the desert." And I do feel like these lines of the epigraph curve through the desert of this book, beginning to end. But when we get on to the next page, we realize that you're also talking about a different sort of line, because we get one of Downes's paintings of an electrical substation.
Right.
With the electrical lines coming off of the substation.
Right.
And so these lines of truthful words are not beautiful, beautiful words are not truthful are going through the desert, but we're also seeing something that's ugly, potentially, a substation that a lot of people might erase from their memory of a vacation.
Right.
Maybe being something truthful about how humans could potentially live and what relationship do they live to nature when they're out in the desert.
Right.
But after the painting, we get a one-line page that says, "Hey, beautiful Marfa," suggesting that maybe there's something about the beautiful Marfa that isn't truthful. And I feel like we could take that little gesture and that enactment you do in like 3 or 4 pages of image and and very few words.
Yeah.
I feel like in a way could be seen as an ethos for the whole book. But before we talk about and uncoil this tension between truth and beauty, I was hoping maybe you could talk about why you chose Downes to collaborate with, whether there was something about either his aesthetic as a painter and illustrator, or whether it had to do with his own personal connection to Marfa as a Marfa artist who had Donald Judd's sculptures as one of his subjects at one point.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I was probably writing this book for 2 or 3 years, and it's gone through many evolutions and changes in its structure and how it was going to finally be. And it was only then, 2 or 3 years in, that I actually wrote Rackstraw, and I had known about his work before going to Marfa, and but he wouldn't describe himself as a Marfa artist. He actually spends half the year in Presidio, which is about half an hour away on the border, and I think he's very much a solitary artist, and I think he deliberately moved there instead. Although of course he has friends in Marfa, and he would visit, as you said, also to paint there. Not just the substation, but some of the art there. And so as we were corresponding, I mean, his art, I wrote the first substation poem before we actually knew that we would be including these images, largely because I also like that substation that's in Marfa. It's right next to an old ice factory. And also I had known about these series of paintings that he had done of the substation. When I wrote him, we were just talking a lot about, I was asking him if he would want to contribute something to the book, because everything about it just fit with what his work with this book. Like you were talking about the electric lines and transforming energy and these, like that line, the epigraph, the lines that curve through the desert. I mean, that's very much poetic line and these wires. And it was funny because he wrote back and he sent me this essay by Fairfield Porter, an artist that he had known, and he had edited a book of essays of Porter's. And essentially the essay was a review of an exhibition, and the gist of it that I took of it was these kind of collaborations don't really work. And so I I've said this before, I really like that, and we continue to write and over time. And at one point I sent him a poem, and he suddenly wrote back and he really loved it, and he was the one suggesting to use the paintings in the book. And and so I was kind of amazed at that. And so as we continued to write, he invited me over to his studio, and he makes a lot of drawings before he paints. He calls them preparatory drawings, and so he had a large number of these drawings that he made of this particular series of paintings from Marfa to Presidio via the grid. And so I looked through all these drawings, and I kind of chose 13 of them to also kind of echo that journey through the book and also through the desert that are also found in the book. And so there's kind of this visual poem and then the paintings that kind of connect it. And so that was kind of how that came about with Rackstraw's work. And his practice is very much an empirical kind of practice, and it's over a lot of time. It's going to the same spot for many months, sometimes leaving and coming back. And so it's a very also physical practice. And between his being there and what he perceives and then what he's putting down on in the painting. Yeah.
Well, the New York Times art critic Ken Johnson, he described Downes as painting beautiful pictures of ugly places. and in a way, it feels like when you mention the way he returns with sort of an attentiveness to place over time, and it sort of feels like you're doing something similar, pointing out the things that are sort of willfully or casually not seen or erased or edited out in order to, say, experience Marfa only as the wondrous and weird art mecca in the desert. And it seems important to me that you start not in Marfa, but with your arrival in the El Paso airport.
Right.
Because the curving line through the desert isn't just the poetic line and the electric lines, it's also the border.
Right.
Another
Exactly.
curving line through the desert. And perhaps the ugliest, and then also if we're going by the epigraph of Lao Tzu, the most truthful line.
Right.
So tell us why we start in El Paso for you, and what that means as a first gesture for exploring Marfa to start at the El Paso airport.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important part of the start of the book too, it wasn't always there for the book, but it also kind of signified my original arrival and people's arrival. Most people's arrival to Marfa is through El Paso, unless they take the train or drive. But and so and being in El Paso and just seeing, I'd never been to El Paso, and just seeing the city, and you're driving through, and you're really right along the border there. And I've read about this a lot, and Juarez across the way there, but to see it is something else. And so it's, I grew up in San Diego, so I know some about the border there and La Jolla and Tijuana. But it was just an important place, I think, for the book to start too, and it fit because also of arriving there, and then the time it takes, it's like a 3.5 hour drive to Marfa through the desert first, along the border, and so it seemed like a good place for the narrative of this book to start too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel like you...
And all the issues, all the issues of the border and the U.S. So...
And the juxtaposition, you're picked up in a Prius.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're contending with the border violence, border surveillance, the killing of women in Juarez, and sort of expanding and dilating a moment that I think a lot of people in transit to the artist residency wouldn't necessarily stay in their minds. And when we have that and the painting of the substations and your poems on Ciudad Juarez, it feels like in a handful of pages, you've not just situated us in place, but you've also raised questions of racism and misogyny and climate and nature and poverty and wealth. You have this line in that section, I don't know which to hate more, violence or the causes of violence, my hate or the hate of others. And I wondered if you could maybe speak to this line in relationship to your meditation on Ciudad Juarez and El Paso and Marfa.
It's such a dark part of our history, both sides of the border. But those lines specifically, I mean, it's obviously an allusion for those who read Wallace Stevens to 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And he has a line, something like about, I don't know which, or about the whistle of the blackbird. And I'm forgetting exactly. But so those lines, I mean, Juarez has been so kind of the worst of almost everything of our history and of contemporary history, Mexico's history, these murders of women that really no one knows what's going on, but obviously it's connected to the drugs and to the cartels, and also just the way power works in our country and the factories along the border there, the foreign factories in Mexico, maquiladoras and things. And so I've read a lot about that history, and I mean, it's also something that you don't want to, Juarez as a city has been trying to become a city, and so you don't want that to just be the kind of focus and the overpowering memory of this place. And it's not, I think. And so it was interesting because while I was writing this from the start to beginning, things were changing in Juarez as well, from what I read and from hearing from people. It had gotten a lot better, and there was a lot more going on. But unfortunately now it's actually turning again, the past couple of years. And so these cycles seem to come and go there. But those lines, I mean, it's really just about an individual perception and responsibility. Also, that feeling of a little bit of help, actually a lot of helplessness, also in the face of all this violence, and then just what can we do really with hate, because and that idea of what, the hate that kind of seems to perpetuate these things and anger and violence, but so it was kind of trying to deal with that in a way, and all on the different sides of that,
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Jeffrey Yang about his latest poetry collection, Hey Marfa, from Grey Wolf Press. In your last collection, Vanishing Line, you also explore lines,
Yep. Yeah.
timelines, bloodlines, and these join the borderline and the high voltage lines of this latest one. Throughout this book and the last book, you collage and interweave other voices into your poems. We might get quotes from a settler from the 19th century, or from a newspaper article, or from one of Donald Judd's cooks. And I was curious if there was an ethos or a desired aesthetic or political effect you were going for by enacting this, by placing your voice among many voices, by perhaps interrupting the cohesion of a lyric I wondered about your thoughts on changing the syntax by having other voices, by interbraiding essentially like a community, not just in space but across time.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, I love having these voices in poems and poetry, and I mean, early on, I knew that these kinds of voices would be a part of the book. Just because it's the fabric of the place and the history there and of our country. And so I try and incorporate those quotes and those other people in ways that are respectful, and also are part of the themes and interweavings of the poems, because I really think of it as a weaving in and out of different histories and languages and more maybe travel kind of observations and nature kind of writing. And so these things all become a part of what the book is, and in a way of also trying to capture a bit of the spirit of the place. And so, yeah.
Well, another set of voices that we encounter regularly in the book are quotes from something you call the Book of Last Words,
right? Yeah.
Which we soon figure out are literally the last words spoken by someone before they die.
Right.
Either the last words of an artist or the last words of an inmate executed by the state of Texas. So here again, maybe the twinning of ugliness and beauty. But I was wondering if you could tell us how these ended up in the book, and to what end we keep being reminded of the last words.
Yeah, no, that became part of the book pretty early on. I've been struck by last words, for a while, and also just this idea of what last means. But you're right; these are all very, very real last words. And so I was surprised because I had written some of these things down before. But then I actually discovered there's these anthologies of last words, and lots of them are from, the 19th century, if I'm remembering correctly, where it was more popular to record these things, whether it was a loved one or famous people or something when it was possible, and somehow it just became a part of kind of the history and mythology of a person's life, And so it's not just most of the time in these anthologies they're well-known people in some way, political figures or writers and things like that. But then a lot of these last words I kind of also found on my own, and also there's last words that are included of people who were executed in Texas, and that I found kind of by chance, because these words are all online. I mean, they're all kind of there as a kind of document. It's really a horrifying thing to read and go through, but there's hundreds of them, and so I thought it was very important to include that as well as part of the book.
I made up my own narrative, thinking that you were working on the June 4th elegies, the Liu Xiaobo elegies, death haunted. Yeah, he's in jail. Yeah. Nobel Peace Prize winning
Yeah.
writer, no longer with us. But
Right.
I wondered if that played any role in informing that choice.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I had never met Liu Xiaobo. He was already in prison, and there was always the big chance that he was never going to get out of prison because his health was never particularly good. You know, it definitely worsened. And then it happened. He died still in prison, basically. And so that, and also there was some people who I'd met in Marfa who later passed away. You know, there's a historian who I met there, she was at that point blind, and she had written this 2-volume history of Marfa. And she passed away, and there was a woman named Taigi, a rancher who I'd met. And then other people. There was the writer, the poet Robert Creeley, who had gone to Marfa and got sick there, and then passed away. Mm. And so there was a lot of this this death that was there already. And so the Book of Last Words. I mean, they're also these last words that are recorded become a kind of odd summation of a person's life, for better or worse. But they have this heightened magnetic quality that I find also can be connected to just a poem or poetry, the poetic line in ways. And so it also made sense to incorporate that. And so I just kind of imagined this Book of Last Words that these lines would be a part of. Yeah.
Well, one thing I noticed about the language of the settler colonists of Marfa, as well as sometimes in the last words of a dying person,
Mm-hmm.
is a tendency towards the abstract and non-specific. For instance, you quote Elsie Bright, a
Mm-hmm.
cattleman and churchman from 1885, who says, "Before me was a new and untried country, an experiment." And Elsie Bright's phrase made me wonder if that sort of language that doesn't have to contend with other voices,
Mm-hmm.
that is unimpeded and sort of cast over everything without a counterpoint,
Mm-hmm.
is a vehicle for violence, or a potential vehicle for violence. So I think of a quote from
Mm-hmm.
the Martinique poet Edouard Glissant,
Mm-hmm.
who says, "I say that relation is made up of all the differences in the world, and that we shouldn't forget a single one of them, even the smallest. If you forget the tiniest difference in the world, well, relation is no longer relation. Now, what do we do when we believe this? We call into question in a formal manner the idea of the universal. The universal is a sublimation, an abstraction that enables us to forget small differences. We drift upon the universal and forget these small differences, and relation is wonderful because it doesn't allow you to do that." And I wondered your thoughts about this sentiment of his, and whether this at all underlies your choice to, contrary to, say, the settler
Mm-hmm.
language, often you're specifying and cataloging, it feels like, in your books, whether it's an aquarium or the events that happen in the encounters with indigenous populations in Vanishing Line.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like you're doing something that is both polyvocal and specifying around things that are erased.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love that quote. I could have used that in the book too. But no, I think like the Bright quote that you mentioned, it's true. There is something so general but also beautiful about that. But then by bringing it into the book, I was hoping to kind of, counterpoint with these other voices. But I mean, I think a lot of what I love about poetry is in the particulars, in the very small particulars of whether it's the subject matter or in the smallest words. You know, George Oppen was always talking about the smallest words are the hardest ones to get right in a poem, and so no, that's a very important part for me when I'm writing, and trying to kind of move between those things. But it's also, I mean, those words of a settler. It's also you see a lot of travel writing, and the history of travel writing as a kind of can be a very kind of colonistic kind of colonizing gesture in generalizations. I mean, obviously, the best travel writing is not like that, but and so trying to also question that and subvert that, as a kind of record of being in a new place. I've always been a fan, I mean, since college, of Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, which is about, this tourist going down to, I think it was Jamaica, if I'm remembering right. But, and just challenging, all of our assumptions and not being blind to what is there, and being a more aware and conscious of your surroundings as a visitor to a place. And so I was trying to do that as well, as much as I could with this book. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good time to hear a little bit of the poetry.
Sure. Yeah.
I've picked out two, page 24 and page 35.
Okay. Conquistadors. Sunrise over a dirt road, by a low-wire fence, birdsong. A rooster crows, then distant church bells, pealing arpeggios in the thin air. Two horses graze next to a roofless ruin. Light slowly swells, expands, fills the heavens, awakens the undergrowth, and the blood of the defeated running fast through the earth. Called minorities by conquest, swept along, on and beyond the state's 3 reservations. Land once a republic of raids and counter-raids, of alliances kept and broken, of patara bueyes humanos sumas cados, of arbados, cotalchuches, jicarillas, lipans, of chibolos, kikapus, susolas, quitoles, malacones, of neches, Coayas, Coyoteros, Atayos, Apaches, Comanches, Atacapans, of Piros, Mescaleros, Wichitas, Tauvayas, Tonkawas, Bidais, Teas, Cheyans, Kiowas, Karankawas, Yutas, and on, diverse nations known through paged, named each stretch of sand, unspoken presence. I hope I got some of those pronunciations okay. That was the first time I read that. Although I always read it aloud when I'm...
Yeah, it's a difficult. I chose a difficult.
No, it's great. I'm glad. I like it. And this is called Substation. And actually, this is the first substation poem I wrote for the book, but I think it's the second one that appears in the book. Substation. Live lines lead to the substation grid, vital node between the tracks in a lonely row of small houses, where an asphalt road meets lattice towers, high-tension buses and switches. Transmission lines sail to lightning gyres. Lugs fix cross strut to strut transformers induct. Step up, step down, fenced off structure, wooden pylons against sand and sky. Insulators, isolators, arresters, X'd constructed monument to the unknown prisoner. Receding cube within cube of walls of air. Pantographic, galvanized gantry, breaker and fuse, relay equipage, kilovolts hum unending ohm of the lamp's transmission. Down at the switch yard, through the body, electromagnetic, lines bond totemic, linked, desert succulence, less wilderness, less relentless wasteland, lines, further prospect, toward a pure array of sun.
I've been listening to Jeffrey Yang read from Hey Marfa from Grey Wolf Press. I forgot that this poem has a nod to Whitman with the line through the body, electromagnetic.
Right, yeah.
But I do want to ask you about Walt Whitman.
Okay, yeah.
Because recently I had Tommy Pico on. He's from the Kumeyaay Nation near San Diego.
Yeah.
And his work explicitly declares a distrust of the first person plural, use of we, and an ambivalence to abstract language.
Yeah.
So I was asking him questions, particularly as an indigenous poet, about his feelings about Walt Whitman. Since Whitman is explicitly trying to embody the American experiment, and because he employs a seemingly universal I and we in the service of a sort of poetic nation building, and because Whitman has a spotty, troublesome, and contradictory set of views toward indigenous people, toward African Americans, toward Mexicans, and others that he didn't see quite fitting into the American experiment as he saw it. And all of Tommy Pico's books are book length. And so at one point I asked him what books influenced him, and he said Vanishing Line is one of the books that was influential. And I hadn't read it yet at the time. This was a couple months ago. And so I didn't know that your book, Vanishing Line, engages with the genocide of Native nations and also quotes Walt Whitman directly. So that was an interesting segue and coincidence. And I wanted to just read a short passage that you quote in Vanishing Line and then ask you some questions.
Sure.
So this is what you say in Vanishing Line. Whitman, who in March 1846 calls the slave trade a monstrous business, a disgrace and a blot on the character of the Republic, 1 year later writes, with the present slave states, of course, no human being anywhere out from themselves has the least shadow of a right to interfere. 10 years later, he shifts emphasis and says, speaking about Africa, in their own country, degraded, cruel, almost bestial, the victims of cruel chiefs and of bloody religious rites, lives never secure, no education, no refinement, no elevation, no political knowledge. Such is the general condition of the African tribes. It is also to be remembered that no race ever can remain slaves if they have it in them to become free. Why do the slave ships go to Africa only? So I was wondering if you could speak to why we find these lines in Vanishing Line, and how, as an American poet yourself and a poet of color, how you orient yourself to Whitman and sort of his embodiment of the national project. Because then I think about, like when we were talking about L.C. Bright, and I said, is there violence in this abstraction? And you said, yes, maybe, but it's also really beautiful. And clearly Whitman is very beautiful. And then we go back to the epigram that you have at the beginning of the book, that truthful things aren't beautiful. I'm curious. So tell us about Whitman here in Vanishing Line, and then maybe you can broaden that to some of the stuff you're exploring in the Marfa exploration.
No, that's a good question. I mean, well, just first, I mean, Whitman. I should also say too, because you mentioned in the intro, I also edited this book of Whitman's writings focused on the sea, the poetry and the prose. I mean, Whitman, I have such an admiration for that first edition of Leaves of Grass, which came out in 1855, and these long lines and all these weird ellipses and dots and no titles and you know and these long lines and what it was trying to do at that time. I mean, but it's true. I mean, Whitman is a very contradictory and controversial figure in the sense that he also was, you know, his own best publicist in ways, and so I think in Vanishing Line, in that particular where those lines come up, it was in a long poem called Yennecut in that book, and that book dealt with a lot of the history in the northern tip of Long Island. And so Whitman there, it was important to kind of, for me, to bring in there, like, one, because, you know, Whitman loved Long Island, and he walked along the beaches there. And also as the figure of our most probably revered poet in the U.S., you know, but then also seeing like some of the letters and in his, I think it's his journals, I can't remember, for it's all in these complete works. You could see the prose, a lot of this other prose that isn't as well read, at least previously. And you could see some of these things that he's thinking about race, but then it's so interesting because he keeps it out of the poetry. He keeps that out of the poetry. It's almost like he's editing himself in a way. But and then in these articles, which sometimes aren't even attributed to him, but like as an editorial kind of thing for the paper he happened to be working at the time, or in that sense. So, but it's just so it was kind of shocking to read those things actually, because I had heard about them. I'd actually first read pieces about that, and then to actually go and find it and read it. It's pretty shocking, and it's never taught like that. Whitman is not a complicated figure when you learn about him. When I learned about him in high school, and so for me it was one way in that poem where I was dealing with kind of the history and mythology of that area, or of that kind of imagined place. That he was a part of that landscape. And so in here too, when you're talking about the opening of the West and you're thinking about the desert and just that, and a lot of that history, there's some of the kind of old railroad history that comes in too, which connects to the technology of the wires, it's a similar kind of thing, this idea of what America was supposed to be, and what it really was. And there's such a contrast between that ideal and the real of what was really going on. And Whitman, of course, was always talking about the ideal and the real in poetry and in prose. And so it's those kinds of themes, they're all throughout our history here, and so he just has become, he became part of the text too, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you have that line in Hey Marfa, we extend his leaves with acts of conquest.
Right, exactly. And so that was spoken through a character in the book named Straw, and so. Yeah, I mean, I'm more of the reader who will still read Whitman and still appreciate so much about his work, but it doesn't have to be for me a complete kind of reverence and devotion anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean you have a complicated
exactly,
view
and I think
him.
that's it, and I think it's it's an interesting perspective to have, that you say we don't have as much for someone like Emily Dickinson, who is much more, I mean, seeing those two figures as kind of the founding people of American poetry, in a way, as always pointed to as such, for better or for worse. And so,
well, it's weird how the more we allow her poems to be the way they really were written, the more and more she seems avant-garde today.
Yeah. No, it's true.
But there's a quote from a settler in Vanishing Line. It reminded me of Whitman regarding the danger of people becoming abstractions. So the settler says, after the Christians have multiplied and the natives have disappeared and melted away, a memorial of them may be preserved. And it made me think of how Whitman was very much for preserving native place names across the country. He wanted them preserved unilaterally, I think, and uniformly. Like he wanted the names of the places to be the native names, but he did seem less concerned about the ultimate actual end game for the native people themselves. And there's a poem he has at the end of his life about the redwoods disappearing that a lot of people think is sort of a elegy for the red people, also, that the redwoods would disappear and the red people would disappear, and sort of as part of the inevitable die out for the American project.
Right.
So I want to read one more quote outside of your work by the critical theorist Homi Bhabha that says, "The void that emerges through the act of writing is not an evocative abstraction lost in the mists of metaphor, the void is quite literally the empty space of erasure and extermination, of missing persons, destroyed things, hidden histories, lost records, expropriated lands, murdered minorities. The humanist must graphically evoke such emptiness and erasure without sublimating these absences, remaining all the while wary of every dream and nation. And I guess I wondered what your thoughts were on that quote, because to me, that's a really good description of Hey Marfa.
Yeah.
That it's graphically evoking emptiness as erasure, making visible the absences without sublimating them. But I didn't know if you even sign on to the sentiment of the quote in the first place. So I was curious what your thoughts were about maybe one of the projects being to make graphic what has been erased.
Yeah. No, I mean, I mean, I don't know what the exact context of the quote, of course, but from what you read there, I mean, no, I would agree with that too, because it's, I mean, in this book, I was also trying, you're talking about the graphic representation, but the poems unfold in a very visual way too. I mean, they're not just left justified or something, and so, and that took, that was a big part of how I was writing this book, and so, and one of the reasons why, I mean, you're talking about hidden histories and things, and so, I mean, one is that I've always, you know, I think of poetry on one level as a kind of digging, you know, below the surface of things, to kind of deeper truths and trying to figure those things out. And also that this landscape, this desert landscape, it could be deceptively recursive in a way, repetitive. You're kind of driving out there or walking, and it's you could be I mean, I was just completely overwhelmed by, you know, that contrast between the scrub and the sand, the hills in the distance, and then the sky, which is just enormous. And something's going on in the air there too. But then as you look more closely, you know, and people have asked me this before, and I don't know how else to say it, so I could have to repeat myself here. But as you look more closely, you really see how diverse even just the ecological life, you know, the plants and the animals live there and have found a home there. And it's the same with us as well. And so the book kind of unfolds in this kind of visual way, and on the one hand trying to echo some of that recursiveness through how the poems are laid out, and also things that kind of come back in different ways, themes and lines, and trying to really delve into some of those kind of places in history or in or how we view kind of nature in a way that have been, I don't know, overlooked in ways, or kind of deliberately repressed, you know, through our through the way we've kind of dominate the land here. So those are some of the things that.
Well, as we move toward Marfa and through the landscape, where we get, it's punctuated by high voltage substations, but it's also punctuated by caves, some of which are the site of the deaths of Chinese laborers.
Yeah, exactly.
Thousands of which died blasting tunnels for the railroad. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that history. I mean, I'm imagining you and Marfa also, you're doing Chinese translation. And also finding this Chinese history. Yeah, I don't know how memorialized or how buried that history is, and how visible is that history. Yeah, or how much did you have to turn over things to find it? Particularly with the Chinese railroad. Yeah, no, I mean that's something that I learned about since college. Really. I mean, not much in high school, but it was really in college when that I read more and looked more at that history,
And it's also when you're dealing with these histories and these things, it becomes immediately complicated, and you're having to find the right balance, at least for me, in trying to write about it. On the one hand, if you look at the history of kind of say Chinese American writing, poets, novelists in the U.S., there's a point where you see that they're almost expected to write about these things. They're kind of like pigeonholed into these kinds of themes and stuff like that, which isn't a fair way to look at the work. But at the same time, I think coming out of that, one being the child of Chinese immigrants to the U.S., it's already kind of there for me to look at. But it's also part of the greater history too. I mean, that's the thing, and so I wanted to write about it. And for this particular history, it's also very hard to write about because there's no written records. I mean, that's in the poem. That's in the poem that I think you're talking about there. There's really no records. There's no letters or anything, and so that's always been. It's still to this day. You read about that history, and it's hard because people hope there's some archive maybe, or some family library where there's some letters or something there. But who knows? And so you're dealing with different kinds of things. You're dealing with like archaeology, and your other disciplines, come in to play very quickly when you're looking at that history, and so as far as the opening of the West is concerned, and dealing with whatever this idea of the West is, we have that history of the railroads is just kind of completely necessary, I think, to think about, and so, and again, also, if you're looking at it from the perspective of how it's been treated in, say, Hollywood or in a lot of writing, it's always usually an afterthought, or just kind of just something, a setting, and so. And so I wanted to kind of like bring that in more deeply in a way, if I could.
Well, I love how we don't get the Marfa reputation until really deep in the book. So we go very far in Hey Marfa before we get the famous art of Marfa, or even your art making in Marfa. But in the heart of the book, we do get a series of poems that are a conversation with this character you mentioned, the gunslinger Straw.
Right.
Who shares his thoughts on nonviolence, on memory, on the nature of Marfa and more. Tell us about Straw, who he is, and how you see him functioning in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have to think it's better for readers if they look at it to figure that out themselves. But I could say like a few things about that. Yeah, no, for sure. That's why I'm here. But so those poems, I mean, it definitely comes directly out of or the idea of the gunslinger. It comes out of Ed Dorn's book Gunslinger, his gunslinger poems. But then, and he of course was dealing with the cliche of the gunslinger in the West, in the history of the West.
Whose poems?
Edward Dorn. Ed Dorn. And so, I mean, what he's doing with it, that he calls him gunslinger throughout, and and what he's doing is different in his long poem, but that figure to shorten it into Straw, S-T-R-A. It's one of the places in the book where there's really a multivalent title. Because those poems are titled Straw, and figure in the book. It was, one of the few really great epiphanies for me I had coming upon that, because it really opened up a way for me to write about some of the things in those poems that I was really struggling with in trying to deal with. And so by giving it a voice to this figure, which kind of alludes to many things. It could be, strata or straw, like a straw man, or even a little bit rack straw.
I was wondering about
that. But of course, that's not him. But so some of these things that and other things that come in with that name really helped me figure out a way to write about that, and also to write about it in the voice, to make it a bit more fun, but also dealing with it in a kind of trying to engage with the subject matter of those poems, through this other voice again, like you're saying. But in this case, it was a made-up voice or imagined voice through straw. Yeah.
Can we hear one of them?
Oh yeah, sure.
Page 56.
Sure. Okay. You always choose the long ones.
Are they all long?
No. I just meant like some of the
Sorry
substation. No, I'm fine. Most people choose the short ones. Okay. Straw. Marfa is no arid La Jolla. No Palm Springs decoy straw holds forth. No, not even a crude tract of La Mancha. They'll lance a windmill here and you'll be shot faster than you can say Alifanfaron. This place is perceived as a small, cosmopolitan oasis, celebrated for its current industry, art. Art as external creative force, more careful development. Matters squalid, desart. An art island that depends on poor locals and neighboring islands to keep costs down. And while not as shaka as Molokai, there's no hurry or rush. Rather, it's one contained speed trap. Push the gas and you'll find yourself at the pink courthouse, begging at the bench of Judge Cinderella, who will take cash for not changing your Prius into a pumpkin. Immigrants, illegals, cruelers and crafters, adobe mixers, day trippers, homesitters, hydroponic tomato pickers, ranchers, loners, passing celebrities and photo shooters if passing quickly, registered sex offenders if not offending, poets and failures, javelina, sausage makers, bond makers, readers, and home birthers, all make up the local fix. A place of few first words, desperado bookishness, no public playground, kids, scarce public schools and a downswing, low rent housing, harder to come by as out-of-towners buy and sell and buy, population waivers around 2,000, 70% Obama voters, most common surname Sanchez or Martinez, pick your plot, Latino or Anglo, bookstores to die for, ditto the radio station, cozy library, camp in a trailer, eat Mediterranean in a trailer, drool over Ramona's burritos. Chain scarce, mind clears, leave your pretense at the Prada. A quiet simplicity settles in. To start anew or continue to lose your way and loose your imagination farther out to Presidio's giant battery reserve. Straw pauses. Tosses back his mescalero, and I noticed a scar running across the gular skin of his throat. But hey, Marfa, what do I know? I just got here. Tomorrow, hasta pronto. An airstrip would kill you.
Been listening to Jeffrey Yang read from Hey Marfa. I wanted to touch briefly on the Marfa lights, which are an attraction and also with a lot of legend behind them.
Oh, yeah.
So they also feel like they might be a physical manifestation of this idea of abstraction, or like the desert as the blank slate. So there's this writer, Kathleen Schaefer. She's the author of Marfa, The Transformation of a West Texas Town. And she says the most fascinating aspect of the lights is that in a group of curious onlookers, some people will see them and others won't. She says, I think about the way we see things, how we see the landscape, but it's also about who is doing the seeing. Seeing a landscape is not a given, it's an active process. So I was curious about whether you saw them, and also if you could talk about maybe the legend of them.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I definitely saw them. I mean, as they are written about in the book. But the first time I actually saw them or imagined seeing them was actually in college too. I was in a class with Quincy Troop, and he had invited this writer, Catherine Bowman, a poet, who I think is from El Paso. Anyways, she came to the class and she, actually, I don't even think she read the poem. We were given her book to read for the class, and I read a book, and I think it's actually called Marfa Lights, but it's about the Marfa Lights. That was the first time I ever heard of Marfa and the lights, and already I was kind of, I was really struck by that image, you know. And so, I mean, I'll just say a little bit of how, I mean, these lights that are seen out there in the desert specific to Marfa have been, they've been explained in different ways, whether it's kind of the elements in the earth rising into the air and the atmosphere, you know, or the particular geographic kind of like, what do they call those, the Nazca lines in the desert kind of things, or whether it is actual UFO kind of things. And so it's definitely part of the mythology and geography of Marfa. So much so that when you go out there, you drive like a mile or two out of town, and there's actually a Marfa Lights observation area there. You know, and so and so it's everyone who goes there tries to see them. I'll just say that.
Could you read the lights?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, the lights. Actually, I just saw that this poem was put on LitHub. John Freeman had put that on there, so I was grateful for that. And yeah. Anyways, I was just saw that. It's called The Lights. One night we sought out the lights off an empty highway. Not a soul but us four on some version of the No Tour, among others brought here before and after by a gift, dropped into a bracket of words, listening to the cosmic noises in the night. And on the horizon we saw the lights, hovering eerily for a moment. Chills at being chosen, growing brighter, then disappearing, reappearing, following the curves we realized of the distant road. We waited longer in the darkness. There must have been stars, but I can't remember any. Then lights on the highway slowly neared us on the divide, closer, closer. The lights of the Luciferum pulled round, blinding us. A patrolman stepped out, asked us what we were doing here, in the middle of nowhere, alone, on the highway in the middle of the night. He searched our car, paced to and fro, scanning our faces with a bitty flashlight. Dispatcher's voice abruptly beckoned over the radio, saving us for a moment. The patrolman spoke a few words in a low voice, then walked back toward us with a last question. You all are Americans, aren't you? And we lied and said yes, and he nodded and turned, told us to keep out of trouble before hitting the leather, and drove off. While in my mind I could feel the gunslinger's stare, the grave, cold look he cast at me from the saloon seat next to me when he tried to warn me, this is a desert full of fucking agents who want to fuck you. And that kind of opens up the gunslinger's the straw sequence.
It's a great opening.
I don't know. I'm not allowed to say that on the radio.
Well, this will just be in the podcast.
Okay. Oh, right. Of course.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the way you engage place
Yes.
in your work, not just present day space of place, but also place across time, because it kind of reminds me a little bit of the eco-poetics of Forrest Gander.
Oh, yeah.
The way he uses the geological idea of the core sample.
Uh-huh.
So in a way, it feels like you're doing a core sample of Marfa.
Yeah.
And I also kind of wondered if
Yeah.
the polyvocality of both of your work, if it's a coincidence that you're both translators and collaborators with other artists.
Yeah.
If there's something about maybe the decentering of self or the engagement with otherness. And then you have this line, this poem by Robert Duncan at the end of Vanishing Line.
Right.
Let us speak of how these perishing things uphold me so that I fall into place.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have that. We have the repeated substations in Hey Marfa reminding us that our relationship to the land isn't sustainable or reciprocal, and that we aren't thinking of the perishing things as we engage with the place. And your aquatic bestiary, enumerating and cataloging marine creatures, feels as a counterpoint to this, an engagement with place. And even the books you've translated, so the book by Beidao, his autobiography, City Gate Open Up. He hasn't been to his home in 13 years. And he goes back not recognizing it at all. And so his autobiography is sort of rebuilding Beijing in his mind in words. And in the introduction to the anthology you edited on poems about grief or mourning, you say that mourning happens in an in-between state, in a measure of time and space suspended for remembering, that poetry mediates a space between grief and transformation so that the time of grief can also become a time of gratitude. So it's just a long-winded catalog, but I'm curious about your thoughts on place and whether, I mean, would you consider yourself a poet with eco-poetics, or is that a strange label to associate with you?
No, I mean, no, I would happily be a part of that group or conversation. I mean, I think it's, and I think, you know, for me and the work, it's very important to me too. This idea of an ecosystem and a ecology and eco-poetics. I mean, I couldn't even really define what that word means, what it is. I mean, I've read things about it and anthologies, but I think it's important. And you know, there's a poet, also a Chilean poet, Nicanor Parra, who is known mostly for his anti-poems, he calls them. But he's also writing these things he called eco-poems. And in a quote or in an interview or a poem, I can't remember, he talks about ecology and you know, this idea of the eco-poem is crossing all boundaries. Like he's able to, it doesn't become, you know, he's able to talk about these things with everybody, and everyone can kind of be on the same page more or less in some way because the evidence is so apparent, you know. And if he was still alive, I wonder what he'd think about like all these, you know, climate change deniers and trying to, you know, but at the heart, they must know, you know, like people like that who try and like change it. I think they really know, and I think we're seeing that. And so, no, I would see that. I would see myself in that tradition as well. And Forrest Gander too. I mean, I love his work and his core sample book. And you know, we're also friends as well. I just saw him in San Francisco and got to hang out with him. And his work is fabulous. I mean, the language, and he also uses this kind of very scientific language and comes directly out of his being a student of geology, and this idea of the core sample, you know, which I love too, you know. And I once was able to visit, you know, a core sample archive,
Really?
which was it's great. It's right outside of the city of New York and on the towards the Palisades. I can't remember the name of this, but it's a research institute that's connected to Columbia in some way. Or these students could go there, but it's this whole library of core samples, and you just trying to see like what happened through geologic time. And then that kind of vertical idea of time and place. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the fascinating things about anywhere, you know, wherever you go, there is this ecological and also geological history, and then you're dealing with the history of humanity, you know, and what we've done with the environment. I think it's, there's also a discipline, ethnography, that I love to read books in that field, and I think ethnography is able to be a place where other disciplines cross, and I see that with poetry too, and just in a similar way as this idea of place can be, across disciplines, and being able to bring in different things. Yeah.
Well, you have this in the introduction to your anthology, Birds, Beasts, and Seas, Nature Poems. You paraphrase the Japanese philosopher Karatani. Is that how you say
Oh,
it?
yeah, exactly.
Karatani.
Yeah.
And he says, nature is the negative figure at the heart of our making. Nature is complexity in simplicity. Nature is a god in ruins. Nature is a rightness of self. Nature is a constant regeneration. And then this last line is what I want to hear what you make of this last line. Nature lets us speak. Poetry is its excess.
Yeah, that's actually mine line at the end.
Really?
At the end there. Yeah.
Well, I love that line.
Yeah, so he has a line in there, and then I kind of like spin off from it. And I wrote that a long time ago, so I'd have to actually look and see what is what. But that I could claim that line.
Well, it made me think of Forrest Gander sometimes talks about certain cultures where the words aren't coming from the speaker.
Right.
It's more like a shamanistic view.
Oh yeah.
So if
Right.
poetry is the excess,
right,
and nature is what lets us speak, then in a way we're speaking. Nature is speaking through us.
Yeah. And also, that kind of thing that comes at the end of the preface was trying to sum up a little bit of what how I was approaching editing an anthology of quote unquote nature poems, which can also be called eco poems, or I know people philosophers make trying to make a distinction between that ecology and nature, but in this case I kind of equate the two, and so it was a kind of, that summation was kind of a way of trying to see how nature is both outside of us and inside of us, and is us and a part of us, and so trying to kind of get that perspective of in and of out, or it's almost impossible, and so what is the poem trying to do, in its relation to nature and art in general? I don't think art can really move away from nature. It's always part of nature. People have tried, even abstract expressionists and stuff, and or not, if not explicitly, with that in mind. It's the great inspiration for everything, for all of our art, and whether directly or indirectly, and so and then to see what we're doing in our actions, with the environment and how we live, it's just an untenable situation, and I think we know this more now, and many people are trying to, of course, change that, but I think a poem tries to become more aware of that too. Yeah. But I'm really interested in the shamanistic side of things too.
You are.
Yeah. There's even a poem, a vanishing line, that with shamans in it, or shamanistic kind of things, and then Osman, the Uyghur poet, I co-translated with himself. He sees, the Uyghur tradition. It comes directly out of that idea of a shaman, poetic oral tradition. Yeah.
Could you read us Sod?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sod. Each day at the hottest hour, the lady's sprinklers turn on to water her squared patch of lawn. Turf green bracketed between plots of low chroma, friable yard, a desert dream of sod, sushi baran. And this continues on this page. There's two other little poems here. Epigraph to desert passages from Voss. Quote, deserts have been shown to resist history and develop along their own lines. A mirage of sameness dispelled, each sand grain a snowflake, each desert distinct epoch to biome, each sunset heaven displaced, each memory absquatulates from arid vacancy to a margin of safety, from profundity to mortality, from tragedy to microalgae salinity, promise of configurative energy.
That ending reminds me a little bit of the final poem or the final part of An Aquarium, which begins with the out of harmony human with the 67 atomic bomb tests in the Marshall Islands.
Yeah.
And it ends with an algae that's discovered then, a type of algae that lives symbiotically in a reciprocal relationship with the coral, but the coral that was now dead. And that relationship was something in biology called mutualism.
Yeah.
That might hint at a different possibility of how to relate to the land.
Yeah.
And to history and to otherness than perhaps a substation would. But I also wanted to ask you about this mutualism in relationship to the way you use circles and the way you're meditating on circles.
Right.
Because at one point in Hey Marfa, Rackstraw Downs quotes Cézanne, and he said, "By force of looking and working, nature becomes concentric." And Downs later in the book quotes Henry James, who said, "Really, universally, relations stop nowhere, and the exquisite problem of the artist is eternally but to draw, by a geometry of his own, the circle in which they shall happily appear to do so." And then we have multiple poems in the book entitled Circle.
Right.
What's going on with circles?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple things about that in the book. I mean, the shape of the circle is very important as a metaphor and also as a structuring element in the book. Not that to say that the whole book kind of begins and ends in the same place, but more in the sense of the book kind of circles out from Marfa into other things, other places, other philosophies and things. And I don't know if it's more of like a rippling concentric thing, but so the poems in the book called Circle that are threaded throughout the book here and there, they kind of also take a circular shape in the sense that the line kind of, or the poem begins with the same line and ends with the same line, sometimes with two or three of the lines. And then I even kind of like went outside that and did that with one or two, maybe just one other poem, the Substation poem, that's with a different title. And again, it was just another way of trying to echo or trying to tie things together and make really kind of try and make this idea of a circle resonate in different ways. I mean, I should say too, like that idea of the form of the poem and the circle. I mean, I can remember in 7th grade a friend of mine writing a short story, and it kind of began and ended with the same paragraph. You know, that way of writing, and so I think that isn't necessarily new, but it was a fresh and childlike way playful way of nodding to that form, that shape. What else did you mention again about the other circles? I
was thinking also mutualism.
Right. Yeah.
And
so.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, you had mentioned that poem in the book of Aquarium, the last Susanthally, and it does. Those kinds of relationships do form a circle in our scientific world. In our environment, but it's not just, that's the thing. It's always more complicated than even, I mean, we're able to look at these things. I was a marine biology or neuroscience major in college, and I used to take all these biochemistry classes and things. And when you look at these pathways, you're really having to kind of just simplify it in a way so that we can understand it. But these pathways are they're always connected to other pathways. It's not just, you can't just have the single circle.
Right.
So if you have, say, in the example of the in the coral, the algae, and the symbiotic algae and the coral, and how that all works. You have to look at it in other circles too that are always moving around, and so there is this kind of almost spherical shape that comes up too, of these circles being supporting each other, sustaining each other, and rather than kind of just like being a parasitic kind of thing, which also exists in nature, but it can't survive without these other circular relationships. And so trying to find that with our relationship to each other and our environment and to place is, I think is really the key if we want to survive, rather than trying to like move to Mars or something.
Well, I was taking that idea of mutualism and placing it into asking the question, not about algae and coral, but about humans in place. Mm-hmm. Because partially the Cézanne quote was intriguing to me, and maybe this is getting too metaphysical when he says, nature becomes concentric by force of looking and working, mm-hmm. which seems to suggest that we are active participants.
Yeah.
In a way that it becomes concentric.
Yeah.
Through looking and working. And then you've talked in interviews about a quote by an archaeologist, John Malcolm Russell, that you at least at one point had above your desk.
Yeah.
And it said, there is something about having a past, having a sense of who you are, that allows you to measure yourself against what political leaders or market forces that you should be. The twinning of there's something about having a past and having a sense of who you are. Like he's linking the two. Having a past and having a sense of who you are.
Yeah.
And when I think about, say, like Elsie Bright or these other settlers, or sort of a purely aspirational, forward-looking poetry, or poetic vision, maybe it's not about having a sense of who you are.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I'm thinking about the way the core sample is and going in one way, you're going farther away from you. You're digging down into the earth. But in doing so, maybe you're finding out who you are. Yeah. Because you're finding out where you're standing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, I'll say a couple things about that. Like first to the first part of what you just said is that, with Rackstraw and that and his quote, what he's describing and the quote he uses is how he really perceives the world when he's looking at it to paint. It's not something that he imagines. He sees these curves and how he perceives the landscape, and it's there, and I think that's why why that quote is so important to him. You see it too in the paintings in the book and in the drawings, especially one of the drawings where the substation is really just kind of like this curving out at you, and that's how he's viewing it, and that's how his perception of seeing it from where he's standing, that, and when he says when it's by force of looking, it's really through looking and looking and looking and looking. I think that's what it means there, and being open to what he's seeing rather than, say, doing something out of convention or tradition of making, say, a horizon like just whoosh, like flat or something like that. The other thing too, that other quote that you mentioned is really important to me as well. I think it's less about, for me, like digging through these things in poetry and trying to find this past and where our place is in it, it's very much a kind of where you stand kind of thing. And that's kind of how, history, especially, say, in a Howard Zinn kind of tradition of looking at that history and how it relates to each of us, gives us a place in order to figure out how to be strong enough to not be shaped by all these other things that are trying to shape us in ways, you know? And again, it's not always this kind of like this fight, but I think, at least, I think for everyone, I mean, from a very early age, we're being told what to wear and I mean, just on this level, you know, and what to buy and everything like that. That rather than just kind of like, you know, going all in and just not thinking about these things, it's really more about thinking about where, you know, we come from as much as we can and trying to figure out why things are the way they are in order to be able to move forward thoughtfully, you know, and in order to figure out what to do next, rather than say just going along with a new kind of technological invention or something that changes our behavior, and then seeing the repercussions of that, and then catching up, because it always seems like we're having to undo so much right now, and that takes a century, you know, it takes decades to undo, you know, and it can always, I kind of feel like it can be undone, at least, you know, but then rather than always playing catch up in that way, trying to look outside of like what is just profitable, you know, strictly profitable, and trying to figure out how to live more mindfully, you know, in that way, so that we're not always having to kind of undo what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, because that seems like a cycle in itself, in a way, and it's hard to know how to break that in I mean, I think it has been done in different levels, but trying to do that, you know, I think is what a lot of people are trying to do. Yeah.
Well, before we finish, I wanted to ask you a question about process.
Yeah.
Because you've had all sorts of mathematical or numerological constraints as you wrote an aquarium.
Yes.
Using prime numbers and the number 5 as organizing principles. And the book you edited, Time of Grief, is divided into 49 days or stations of grief, which represent the 49 days of the Bardo in the Buddhist calendar, or the 49 days of counting the Omer in the Jewish calendar. So you're supposed to use it as a tool and read poems, specific poems on each of the 49 days while you're in mourning.
Yeah.
So I was curious if there were any constraints that you employed when making Hey Marfa.
Not like that in the same way. There was in the book, there was in the poem Yannicott you mentioned, the 9 poems and 9 sections. In this book, I didn't do that. It was more loose in that way, but and it kind of like was directed by other things, like what we've already been talking about, like some of these repeating poems, titles, the Book of Last Words, and these themes and lines that come through. So no, there wasn't any kind of like real numerical thing, except for you know, yeah. I mean, the circle poems we talked about and stuff, and then the 13 stations. That's probably the only, you know, the numerical thing. The 13 drawings and 13 stations. Yeah.
And what are you working on now?
A couple things. I'll just talk about one of them, because I maybe if we have time, you had mentioned you sometimes have people read something else, but I've been working on this book of essays for a long time. Longer than this book, Hey Marfa, just kind of like off and on. Often kind of just when I get stuck or something needs to rest, I'll just pick something else up that helps me figure something else out. And so these essays that I've been writing, kind of dealing with poetry, translation, and art. Those kind of three main things, and that definitely overlap in ways with the poetry books, you know, some of those things. Like there's, anyways.
Well, could we finish with the reading of the last page of Hey Marfa?
Sure, yeah. I, interloper, who dares to add these grains to the sands, what do you know of yes and no, of wind and bone, of dust and thirst, of the ever-shifting rose and the furiferous, radiant record of the real, sung from the well, aligned in the heliosphere? Can you make the air tremble with brightness? Draw the form from the ash. Center hope's filaments with your unsung song. Hear the moon's echo submerged in the mirror. Your uncertain manifoldness. Your sleep I sail.
It's great having you on the show today, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
We're talking today to Jeffrey Yang, reading from his latest poetry collection, Hey Marfa, from Grey Wolf Press. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. I've uploaded an as-of-yet unpublished poetic essay by Jeffrey Yang called Ancestors, an essay that was inspired by the art of the Korean feminist artist Yoon Sung-nam. This joins bonus material by Layli Longsoldier, Carmen Maria Machado, Therese Marie Myatt, Sheila Hetty, Forrest Gander, John Keane, Jen Bervin, and others. All this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.